In the heart of Tamriel lies a province whose imperial ambitions have shaped the continent for millennia, yet whose earliest foundations remain shrouded in mystery and deliberate obscuration. Cyrodiil, the Dragon Empire's seat of power, harbours secrets that predate even the most ancient chronicles, preserved in the White Gold Tower's deepest vaults. Tonight, we delve into the forgotten histories that imperial scribes have carefully omitted from their official records, exploring the rise and fall of civilizations that once commanded this fertile heartland, long before the first Septim ever dreamed of continental dominion. The conventional narrative speaks of Alessia's rebellion, of the First Empire's glorious founding, and the subsequent dynasties that followed in orderly succession. But this sanitized version obscures a far more complex tapestry of conquest, betrayal, and transformation that began thousands of years before human feet first walked these lands. The Cyrodiil we know today represents merely the latest iteration in a cycle of imperial rise and collapse that has repeated itself across ages, each new power building upon the ruins of its predecessors while deliberately erasing their memory from history. Before we explore these lost empires, we must understand the unique geographical and metaphysical properties that have made Cyrodiil the eternal prize of Tamrielic politics. The province sits at the continental crossroads, where the ancient trade routes of all races converge around the massive Lake Rumara. More significantly, it contains the White Gold Tower, that enigmatic structure whose true origins remain debated among scholars to this day. Some claim it predates even the earliest Aldmeri settlements, rising from the earth itself during the Dawn Era, when the boundaries between myth and reality remained fluid. The tower's presence has fundamentally shaped every civilization that has attempted to claim dominion over this land. Its metaphysical properties seem to attract and amplify imperial ambition, drawing conquerors from across Tamriel, like moths to flame. Yet these same properties that grant power also ensure instability, as the tower's influence creates conditions that eventually undermine even the mightiest empires. Understanding this cycle becomes crucial to comprehending why Cyrodiil has witnessed more dramatic political upheavals than any other province in Tamriel. Our journey begins in the depths of the Merethic era, when the first Aldmer established settlements along the shores of Lake Rumare. These early colonists, fleeing the political upheavals of their homeland in the Somerset Isles, sought to create a perfect society guided by their understanding of divine order and magical supremacy. They named their new kingdom Cyrod, meaning starry heart in their ancient tongue, believing they had found the cosmic center from which their enlightened rule would gradually encompass all of Tamriel. The Aldmeri approach to empire differed fundamentally from the human dynasties that would follow. Rather than relying primarily on military conquest, they established dominion through what they termed crystalline hierarchy, a system that combined magical compulsion with cultural assimilation to create willing vassals from the primitive human tribes they encountered. The Needs, Cyrodiil's original human inhabitants, found themselves gradually transformed from free peoples into a sophisticated servant class that genuinely believed their subjugation represented elevation to a higher form of existence. This early empire achieved remarkable stability through its integration of magical and political power. The Aldmeri sorcerer kings established great academies where the most promising human subjects could study the mystical arts, though always within carefully defined limitations that prevented them from challenging their master's authority. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a society of breathtaking artistic and architectural achievement, with crystal spires and floating gardens that transformed the Cyrodiilic landscape into something resembling the celestial realms the Aldmer claimed as their ultimate destination. Yet even this seemingly perfect system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The Aldmeri obsession with purity and order created rigid hierarchies that struggled to adapt to changing circumstances. As human populations grew and their understanding of magic developed, the delicate balance between ruler and subject began to shift. the sorcerer kings, secure in their assumed superiority, failed to recognize the growing sophistication of their human vassals until it was too late to prevent the inevitable uprising. The collapse of the First Aldmeri Empire came not through external conquest, but through internal revolution led by those who had been most thoroughly integrated into the system. The human mages who had studied in Aldmeri academies turned their learned arts against their former masters, while the Daedric warriors who had served in Aldmeri armies used their military training to coordinate resistance across the province. This pattern of imperial collapse from within would repeat throughout Cyrodiilic history, as each successive empire created the conditions for its own eventual overthrow. Following the Aldmeri collapse, Cyrodiil entered a period of fragmentation that would last for centuries. The great cities that had once served as administrative centers for the unified empire became independent city-states, each ruled by powerful human families who had claimed Aldmeri territories and titles during the uprising. These successor kingdoms, known collectively as the Cyrodiilic petty kingdoms, represented humanity's first experiment with imperial governance on a provincial scale. The most significant of these early human kingdoms was Ayleid, established in the fertile regions around what would later become the imperial city. Founded by the legendary king Thane Sardavar, this kingdom represented the first attempt to create a distinctly human empire that could rival the achievements of their Aldmeri predecessors. Sardavar understood that simply overthrowing the old order was insufficient. To create lasting change, humanity needed to develop its own systems of governance, magic, and culture that could provide stability without relying on the oppressive hierarchies that had characterized Aldmeri rule. The innovations introduced during the Sardavar period would influence imperial development for millennia to come. King Thane established the first human magical colleges, though these institutions emphasize practical applications rather than the theoretical pursuits favored by Aldmeri academies. He created administrative systems based on merit rather than birth, allowing capable individuals from humble backgrounds to rise to positions of authority. Most significantly, he began the construction of the great infrastructure projects that would eventually connect all corners of Cyrodiil through roads, bridges, and magical communication networks. However, the kingdom of Ayleid also demonstrated the particular challenges that would plague all subsequent human empires in Cyrodiil. Unlike the Aldmer, who had possessed centuries of accumulated knowledge and magical tradition, the human kingdoms were forced to innovate constantly, creating new solutions to problems their predecessors had never faced. This necessity for innovation produced remarkable achievements, but also created instability as each generation attempted to improve upon or revolutionize the systems they inherited. The succession crisis that followed Thane Sardavar's death illustrates these broader patterns perfectly. His three sons each claimed legitimate right to the throne based on different interpretations of the succession laws their father had established. The eldest, Prince Sardavar, argued for traditional primogeniture. The middle son, Prince Ayleid, claimed that his superior magical abilities made him the natural heir in a kingdom that relied heavily on mystical arts. The youngest, Prince Cyrodiil, insisted that the crown should go to whoever could demonstrate the greatest popular support among the kingdom's citizens. This three-way civil war devastated the kingdom and created the conditions for external intervention that would reshape Cyrodiilic politics entirely. The Ayleid refugees who had fled to the eastern regions during the human uprising saw an opportunity to reclaim their ancestral holdings while the human kingdoms were distracted by internal strife. These Ayleid remnants had spent the intervening centuries developing new magical techniques and military strategies specifically designed to counter human advantages in numbers and adaptability. The return of organized Ayleid resistance marked the beginning of what scholars now term the Second Morethic Wars, a series of conflicts that would determine whether Cyrodiil's future lay with human independence or renewed Aldmeri dominance. Unlike their predecessors, these later Ayleids had learned from their earlier defeats. Adopting more flexible approaches to governance and warfare, that incorporated elements from human tactical innovations while retaining their inherent magical superiority. The most successful of these Ayleid restoration kingdoms was Nenalata, established in the ruins of an ancient Aldmeri stronghold in eastern Cyrodiil. Under the leadership of King Leloriar and Dainar, Nenalata became a beacon for Ayleid refugees across Tamriel, while simultaneously developing into a formidable military and magical power. Dainar's approach differed significantly from earlier Ayleid rulers in his willingness to form alliances with human groups who shared his opposition to the dominant Cyrodiilic kingdoms. The complexity of these alliances reveals much about the sophisticated political landscape that had emerged in post-Aldmeri Cyrodiil. Rather than simple racial divisions between human and elf, the various kingdoms and city-states formed shifting coalitions based on immediate political advantage, economic interests, and personal relationships between rulers. Some human lords found Ayleid magical knowledge more valuable than ethnic solidarity, while certain Ayleid houses preferred human allies who could provide military strength over fellow elves who might challenge their authority. This political fragmentation created opportunities for external powers to extend their influence into Cyrodiilic affairs for the first time since the original Aldmeri colonization. The Nordic kingdoms to the north saw the human Ayleid conflicts as an opportunity to expand their territorial holdings and establish tributary relationships with weakened neighbors. Simultaneously, the growing Dwemer civilization began establishing trading posts and research facilities throughout eastern Cyrodiil, bringing their advanced technology and enigmatic agenda into the already complex political equation. The Dwemer presence, in particular, would have profound consequences for Cyrodiilic development that extended far beyond their eventual mysterious disappearance. Their technological innovations, from advanced metallurgy to mechanical automation, provided local rulers with new tools for administration and warfare that began to shift the balance of power away from purely magical solutions toward more hybrid approaches combining mystical and mechanical elements. As we trace these forgotten histories, a pattern emerges that would define Cyrodiilic imperial development throughout the ages. Each successive empire built upon the innovations of its predecessors while attempting to solve the fundamental contradictions that had led to their collapse. Yet these same attempts at improvement often created new vulnerabilities that would eventually prove equally devastating. The story of Cyrodiil's lost empires is ultimately a story of ambition colliding with the harsh realities of governing a diverse population across vast territories while maintaining the delicate balance between innovation and stability that imperial success requires. The kingdoms and empires we have explored tonight represent only the beginning of this epic cycle of rise and fall that has defined Cyrodiilic history for millennia. The Nordic intervention in Cyrodiilic affairs began subtly, as most imperial expansions do. King Harald of Windhelm established what appeared to be simple trading relationships with the warring human kingdoms, offering Nordic steel and warriors in exchange for access to Cyrodiilic agricultural surplus and magical knowledge. These seemingly innocent commercial arrangements gradually evolved into something far more substantial, as Nordic military advisors embedded themselves within local courts, and Nordic settlers established permanent communities along the northern borders of the province. The genius of the Nordic approach lay in its patient cultivation of dependency, rather than immediate conquest. Unlike the Aldmer, who had imposed their rule through magical superiority, or the human kingdoms, which relied on administrative innovation, the Nords understood that lasting control required making their subjects genuinely need their continued presence. They positioned themselves as indispensable allies rather than obvious conquerors, allowing local rulers to maintain the illusion of independence while gradually transferring real authority to Nordic administrators and military commanders. This strategy proved devastatingly effective against the fragmented Cyrodiilic kingdoms. King Sardavar of the Eastern Territories found his treasury dependent on Nordic loans to fund his ongoing war against Ayleid restoration forces. Prince Lead discovered that his magical research required Nordic-controlled materials and scholarly exchanges. Even the proud Ayleid king, Laloriar and Dinar, found himself negotiating mining rights and territorial agreements with Nordic representatives, who seemed to appear whenever crucial decisions needed to be made. The transformation of Cyrodiil into a Nordic protectorate occurred so gradually that many contemporaries failed to recognize it until the process was nearly complete. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the systematic construction of Nordic-style fortifications at strategic locations throughout the province, always justified as defensive measures against external threats, but positioned to control internal movement and communication. Trade routes were subtly redirected to flow through Nordic-controlled checkpoints, while local industries gradually shifted to serve Nordic rather than Cyrodiilic needs. The cultural impact of this soft conquest proved even more profound than its political and economic dimensions. Nordic customs began appearing in Cyrodiilic courts as local nobles adopted foreign fashions to demonstrate their cosmopolitan sophistication. The worship of Nordic deities gained adherents among human populations seeking divine protection in uncertain times, while traditional Cyrodiilic religious practices were gradually marginalized as primitive or dangerous. Most significantly, the Nordic language began displacing local dialects in administrative and commercial contexts, creating a generation of young Cyrodiilics who could advance in society only by abandoning their cultural heritage. Yet even this seemingly perfect system of imperial control contained inherent contradictions that would eventually lead to its undoing. The Nordic approach required maintaining a delicate balance between control and autonomy, providing enough independence to prevent outright rebellion, while ensuring sufficient influence to serve Nordic interests. As the system matured and local populations became more sophisticated in their understanding of these arrangements, this balance became increasingly difficult to maintain. The catalyst for change came from an unexpected source: the Dwemer technological revolution that was transforming Eastern Cyrodiil during this same period. The Dwemer, pursuing their own inscrutable agenda, had established a series of research installations and manufacturing centers that operated independently of both Nordic and local political structures. Their advanced metallurgy, mechanical engineering, and magical innovations created new possibilities for economic and military organization that threatened to obsolete the carefully constructed Nordic system of control. The Dwemer presence attracted scholars, craftsmen, and ambitious politicians from across Cyrodiil who saw opportunities to acquire knowledge and technologies that could shift the balance of power in their favor. These Dwemer installations became focal points for indigenous resistance to Nordic influence, not through organized rebellion, but through the gradual development of alternative systems that reduced dependence on Nordic resources and expertise. The situation became critical when several Cyrodiilic nobles began commissioning Dwemer artisans to create weapons and fortifications that rivaled or exceeded Nordic military technology. The traditional Nordic advantages in metallurgy and siege warfare suddenly seemed vulnerable to Dwemer innovations that could produce stronger materials, more effective defensive systems, and entirely new categories of military equipment that Nordic forces had never encountered. Recognizing the threat to their carefully constructed hegemony, the Nordic overlords began pressuring their Cyrodiilic vassals to restrict Dwemer activities within their territories. This pressure created the first serious test of the loyalty systems that the Nords had spent decades building, as local rulers found themselves forced to choose between maintaining Nordic favor and accessing the technological advantages that Dwemer partnership offered. The response varied dramatically across different regions of Cyrodiil, revealing the true extent to which Nordic influence had penetrated local political structures. In the Western territories, where Nordic settlement was heaviest and cultural assimilation most complete, local rulers generally complied with Nordic demands to limit Dwemer operations. These regions maintained their privileged status within the Nordic system, but found themselves increasingly isolated from the technological developments transforming the rest of the province. Eastern Cyrodiil, where Ayleid restoration movements had maintained stronger cultural independence, proved more willing to defy Nordic pressure in favour of Dwemer partnership. The Ayleid king Reman Dynasty formally allied with several Dwemer clans, creating a technological magical synthesis that combined Ayleid mystical expertise with Dwemer mechanical innovation. This alliance produced remarkable achievements in architecture, military engineering, and administrative efficiency that demonstrated alternatives to Nordic-dominated development. The central regions around Lake Rumar found themselves caught between these competing influences, creating a complex political situation where different factions within the same kingdoms pursued contradictory strategies. Some noble houses sought to maintain their Nordic connections while secretly negotiating with Dwemer representatives. Others openly defied Nordic pressure while attempting to preserve enough diplomatic flexibility to avoid complete break with their former protectors. This fragmentation of loyalties created opportunities for the emergence of new political movements that transcended the traditional divisions between Nordic, Ayleid, and human interests. The most significant of these was the Cyrodiilic unity movement, led by a charismatic young noble named Alessia, who had studied in both Nordic courts and Dwemer workshops. Alessia argued that Cyrodiil's future lay neither in continued subservience to Nordic interests nor in the restoration of ancient Ayleid dominance, but in the creation of a distinctly Cyrodiilic empire that could synthesize the best elements from all the cultures that had shaped the province's development. The unity movement's appeal extended across traditional ethnic and political boundaries because it offered something valuable to each major faction. To the human kingdoms, it promised genuine independence from Nordic control. To the Ayleid remnants, it offered recognition and participation in a new political order rather than continued marginalization. Even to the Nords, it suggested the possibility of maintaining their commercial and cultural investments in Cyrodiil within a more stable and predictable political framework. Alessia's genius lay in understanding that successful imperial formation required more than military conquest or political maneuvering. She recognized that lasting empire needed a unifying vision that could inspire genuine loyalty rather than mere compliance. The unity movement therefore emphasized not what it opposed, but what it sought to create: a Cyrodiilic identity that could incorporate diverse cultural elements while maintaining coherent political and economic systems. The practical implementation of these ideals required developing new institutions that could function across the cultural and linguistic divisions that had fragmented Cyrodiil for centuries. Alessia established administrative academies that trained officials in multiple languages and cultural traditions, ensuring that the new empire could govern effectively across its diverse population. She created military structures that incorporated Nordic tactical innovations, Ayleid magical techniques, and Dwemer technological advantages within unified command systems. Most significantly, she began construction of the great infrastructure projects that would physically unite the province in ways that previous empires had never attempted. The unity movement's road-building campaigns connected previously isolated regions while creating employment opportunities that drew supporters from across Cyrodiil's fractured political landscape. These roads carried more than trade and travelers. They transmitted ideas, customs, and loyalties that gradually created shared Cyrodiilic experiences across traditional boundaries. The religious dimensions of Alessia's imperial project proved equally innovative and controversial. Rather than imposing a single religious system or attempting to suppress existing traditions, she developed what became known as the Cyrodiilic synthesis, a theological framework that recognized divine elements within Nordic, Ayleid, and human religious traditions, while positioning them as different aspects of a greater cosmic order. This approach allowed converts to maintain their cultural identities, while participating in a shared spiritual framework that reinforced political unity. The success of these innovations attracted attention from across Tamriel as other regions struggled with their own problems of political fragmentation and cultural conflict. Delegations arrived from Skyrim, High Rock, and even distant Morrowind to study Cyrodiilic administrative methods and consider their application to local conditions. This intellectual influence extended Cyrodiilic power far beyond its territorial boundaries, creating networks of allied rulers and sympathetic populations that would prove crucial during the military challenges that inevitably arose. The Nordic response to these developments revealed the limitations of their indirect approach to imperial control. Having relied on economic dependence and cultural influence rather than direct military occupation, the Nords found themselves with limited options for preventing Cyrodiilic independence. Military intervention would require resources they were reluctant to commit while destroying the very commercial relationships that made Cyrodiil valuable to Nordic interests. Diplomatic pressure had clearly failed to prevent the emergence of the unity movement, and attempts to foster alternative Cyrodiilic leaders had been undermined by Alessia's remarkable ability to co-opt potential rivals into her growing coalition. The growing strength of the unity movement forced the Nordic leadership to confront a fundamental contradiction in their imperial strategy. Their success in Cyrodiil had depended upon maintaining local rulers who were sufficiently independent to provide legitimacy while remaining dependent enough to ensure compliance. Alessia's movement threatened this delicate balance by offering genuine independence combined with the institutional strength necessary to maintain it. The Nords faced the uncomfortable realization that their protégés had learned too well from their mentors. The crisis deepened when several Nordic client kingdoms began openly questioning the terms of their own relationships with Windhelm. If Cyrodiil could successfully assert independence while maintaining prosperity and security, what justification existed for continued Nordic hegemony elsewhere? The unity movement's success created ideological contagion that spread far beyond Cyrodiil's borders, inspiring independence movements across the Nordic sphere of influence and threatening the entire system of indirect control that had defined Nordic imperial policy for generations. King Harald's advisors recommended immediate military intervention to crush the unity movement before it could fully consolidate power. The Nordic military maintained substantial advantages in training, equipment, and battlefield experience that could potentially overwhelm Cyrodiilic resistance if applied decisively. However, such an approach would require abandoning the subtle methods that had made Nordic expansion possible in the first place, transforming the Nords from sophisticated imperial administrators into crude military occupiers. The debate within Nordic leadership revealed deeper philosophical divisions about the nature and purpose of empire itself. Traditional voices argued that power ultimately rested on military strength and that diplomatic niceties were luxuries that could be abandoned when vital interests were threatened. Reform-minded advisors countered that the Nordic Empire's greatest achievement lay in creating voluntary compliance rather than forced submission, and that military intervention would destroy the very foundations of their imperial success. While the Nords hesitated, Alessia moved aggressively to consolidate her position and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. She understood that Nordic indecision created a narrow window of opportunity during which the unity movement could establish sufficient strength to survive direct assault. Her preparations revealed the sophisticated strategic thinking that had enabled her remarkable rise from provincial noble to imperial architect. The military preparations began with systematic recruitment campaigns that targeted not just human populations, but also Ayleid remnants and even Nordic settlers who had developed stronger loyalties to their adopted homeland than to their ancestral kingdom. Alessia recognized that successful resistance required creating genuinely mixed forces that could demonstrate the unity movement's inclusive vision while neutralizing Nordic advantages in battlefield organization. Her recruiting agents offered advancement opportunities based on merit rather than ethnicity, attracting ambitious individuals from all backgrounds who saw the movement as their path to prominence. The training of these diverse forces required developing new military doctrines that could integrate Nordic tactical knowledge, Ayleid magical techniques, and Dwemer technological innovations within coherent operational frameworks. Alessia established military academies that functioned as laboratories for tactical experimentation, where officers from different cultural backgrounds shared their specialized knowledge while developing hybrid approaches suited to Cyrodiil's specific defensive needs. Perhaps most importantly, she began construction of a network of fortified positions that could support sustained resistance against Nordic invasion. These fortifications incorporated Dwemer architectural principles with Ayleid magical enhancements and Nordic defensive concepts, creating strongholds that were simultaneously more sophisticated and more adapted to local conditions than anything previously seen in Cyrodiil. The construction projects served multiple purposes beyond their obvious military value, providing employment for supporters while demonstrating the Unity movement's capacity for major infrastructure development. The economic foundations of resistance proved equally crucial to Alessia's preparations. She understood that successful independence required not just military capability, but also economic sustainability that could survive the disruption of Nordic trade relationships. Her economic policies emphasized developing internal markets and alternative trading partners that could reduce Cyrodiilic dependence on Nordic commercial networks. The Dwemer alliance became central to these economic strategies, as their technological capabilities offered pathways to industrial development that could compete with Nordic production. Joint Cyrodiilic Dwemer workshops began producing goods that combined magical enhancement with mechanical precision, creating products that commanded premium prices in markets across Tamriel. These enterprises generated revenues that funded military preparations while demonstrating Cyrodiil's potential for economic independence. Diplomatic initiatives complemented these military and economic preparations, as Alessia sought to isolate Nordic power by building alternative alliance networks. She dispatched envoys to courts across Tamriel, offering mutual defense agreements and favorable trading arrangements to rulers who might benefit from reduced Nordic influence. These diplomatic efforts gradually created a coalition of interests that viewed Cyrodiilic independence as preferable to continued Nordic hegemony. The religious dimensions of these preparations proved particularly significant, as Alessia worked to consolidate spiritual as well as political authority. The Cyrodiilic synthesis had attracted widespread support by acknowledging diverse religious traditions, but it required institutional development to transform theological concepts into practical organizational structures. Alessia established a council of religious leaders representing all major faiths within Cyrodiil, creating a spiritual authority that could legitimize political decisions while maintaining doctrinal flexibility. This religious council proved instrumental in developing the ideological framework that justified resistance to Nordic authority. Rather than simply opposing foreign rule, the council articulated a positive vision of Cyrodiilic destiny that emphasized the province's unique role as a meeting ground for diverse cultures and traditions. This theological nationalism provided moral authority for political independence while avoiding the exclusionary rhetoric that might have alienated potential supporters from non-human backgrounds. The Nordic response to these preparations revealed the extent to which their imperial system had become dependent upon voluntary compliance rather than coercive capability. As Cyrodiilic resistance solidified, Nordic administrators throughout the province found their authority increasingly ignored by local populations who no longer feared the consequences of disobedience. Tax collection became sporadic, military recruitment ceased entirely, and even basic administrative functions required negotiation rather than simple command. King Harold's final attempt at diplomatic resolution came through a series of proposals that offered increased autonomy within the Nordic system rather than complete independence. These proposals acknowledged many of the Unity movement's grievances, while attempting to preserve essential Nordic interests in Cyrodiilic resources and strategic position. The terms were remarkably generous by traditional imperial standards, suggesting the desperation that Nordic leadership felt as their carefully constructed hegemony crumbled. Alessia's rejection of these proposals marked the point of no return in Cyrodiilic-Nordic relations. Her response demonstrated both political sophistication and strategic insight, acknowledging the generous nature of Nordic offers while explaining why they remained fundamentally inadequate. She argued that genuine independence required not just favorable terms within an existing system, but the creation of entirely new relationships based on equality rather than subordination. The formal declaration of Cyrodiilic independence came during the Autumn Harvest Festival, when representatives from across the province gathered in the ancient amphitheatre overlooking Lake Rumar. Alessia's speech on that occasion became one of the foundational documents of Cyrodiilic political thought, articulating principles of governance that would influence imperial development for centuries to come. She spoke of empire not as domination, but as synthesis, not as the subjugation of diversity, but as its creative integration into larger purposes. The immediate aftermath of the declaration revealed the extent to which Cyrodiilic society had transformed during the years of unity movement organization. Rather than the chaos and fragmentation that typically followed such dramatic political changes, the province experienced remarkable stability as existing administrative structures seamlessly transitioned from Nordic oversight to independent operation. This smooth transition demonstrated that Alessia's preparations had extended far beyond military readiness to encompass the entire apparatus of governmental function. The Nordic military response, when it finally came, encountered resistance that had been shaped by years of careful preparation and strategic thinking. The invasion forces found not the divided and dependent territories they had expected, but a unified province capable of coordinated defense across multiple fronts. The war that followed would test both Nordic military tradition and Cyrodiilic innovations in ways that neither side had fully anticipated, setting the stage for transformations that would reshape the political geography of northern Tamriel for generations to come. The siege of Sancra Tor marked the first major test of Cyrodiilic resolve against Nordic military might. The ancient fortress, perched on its commanding heights above the Nibene Valley, had served as a Nordic administrative centre for decades, its garrison confident in both their strategic position and their professional superiority over what they dismissed as provincial rebels. Yet when the siege began in the depths of winter, the Nordic defenders discovered that their opponents possessed capabilities that traditional military wisdom had never anticipated. Alessia's forces approached the fortress not as a conventional army, but as a coordinated network of specialists whose diverse skills complemented each other in ways that transcended simple tactical cooperation. Ayleid battle mages worked alongside human engineers to create siege engines that combined mechanical force with magical enhancement, producing weapons capable of breaching fortifications that had withstood centuries of conventional assault. Dwemer advisors provided technical expertise in metallurgy and engineering that allowed the besiegers to construct protective barriers and assault platforms using locally available materials transformed through advanced processing techniques. The psychological impact of this technological synthesis proved as significant as its material advantages. The Nordic garrison had prepared to face familiar enemies using established methods of warfare, but found themselves confronting innovations that rendered their defensive preparations obsolete. Walls that had been designed to withstand conventional siege engines crumbled before magical bombardment, while traditional sally tactics failed against mobile fortifications that could advance and retreat according to battlefield conditions, rather than remaining fixed in predetermined positions. More disturbing to the Nordic defenders was the evident unity of purpose displayed by their opponents. Previous rebellions in Nordic territories had typically fragmented along ethnic or regional lines, allowing imperial forces to exploit internal divisions through diplomatic manipulation or selective rewards. The Cyrodiilic forces surrounding Sancra Tor demonstrated no such vulnerabilities, maintaining discipline and coordination, even during the most challenging phases of the siege, when traditional armies would have begun to dissolve into competing factions, pursuing separate agendas. The surrender of Sankator after 3 months of siege sent shockwaves throughout the Nordic sphere of influence that extended far beyond its immediate military significance. The fortress had been considered impregnable by Nordic military theorists, its capture requiring methods and capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. More troubling was the manner of its surrender, as the garrison commander negotiated terms that allowed his forces to withdraw with honor, rather than facing the destruction that conventional wisdom suggested, awaited, defeated imperial troops. Alessia's treatment of the surrendered Nordic forces revealed the sophisticated political calculations that guided her military strategy. Rather than executing captured officers or enslaving defeated soldiers, she offered them opportunities to serve in the emerging Cyrodiilic military structure while maintaining their professional dignity and cultural identity. This approach simultaneously demonstrated the inclusive nature of her imperial vision while depriving Nordic leadership of experienced military personnel who might otherwise have contributed to continued resistance. The political implications of this clemency extended throughout the Nordic Empire as word spread of honourable treatment afforded to defeated enemies. Garrison commanders in other contested territories began considering whether continued resistance served their professional interests or merely prolonged inevitable defeat while increasing the likelihood of harsh treatment. The psychological warfare implicit in Alessia's policies proved as effective as her military innovations in undermining Nordic will to continue the conflict. The campaign that followed the fall of Sankator demonstrated the systematic nature of Cyrodiilic military planning and the extent to which strategic thinking had evolved beyond conventional approaches to territorial conquest. Rather than advancing along predictable routes toward obvious targets, Alessia's forces moved according to logistical and political considerations that maximized their advantages while minimizing Nordic opportunities for effective countermeasures. The liberation of Nordic administrative centres proceeded according to careful schedules that allowed sufficient time for political consolidation before advancing to subsequent objectives. Each captured town or fortress became the foundation for expanded operations, with local populations recruited into Cyrodiilic forces, while captured resources funded continued military expansion. This methodical approach created self-sustaining momentum that grew stronger as the campaign progressed, rather than weakening due to extended supply lines or accumulated casualties. The Nordic response revealed the extent to which their imperial system had become dependent upon psychological rather than material foundations. King Harold's forces possessed superior equipment and training according to traditional military standards, but found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by opponents who understood the political dimensions of warfare in ways that transcended purely tactical considerations. Each Nordic defeat strengthened Cyrodiilic legitimacy, while undermining the prestige that had been essential to maintaining imperial authority throughout Nordic territories. The decisive battle of the war occurred not at some dramatic fortress or strategic crossroads, but in the mundane surroundings of a river crossing where Nordic forces attempted to prevent Cyrodiilic advance toward Windhelm itself. The Battle of Pale Pass became legendary not for its scale or ferocity, but for the complete tactical obsolescence it demonstrated of traditional Nordic military doctrine when confronted with integrated magical technological warfare. The Nordic army that assembled at Pale Pass represented the finest military force that their empire could produce, with elite units drawn from across their territorial holdings and equipped with the best weapons their smiths could forge. Their commander, Jarl Ysgramor the Younger, had studied every available account of previous Cyrodiilic victories and believed he understood the tactical innovations that had enabled their success. His battle plan incorporated countermeasures designed to neutralize magical enhancements, while exploiting what he perceived as weaknesses in the hybrid military structures that Alessia had created. The battle began according to Nordic expectations, with traditional formations advancing across familiar terrain toward positions that offered obvious tactical advantages. Yet as the engagement developed, it became apparent that the Cyrodiilic forces were not merely using magical enhancements to improve conventional tactics, but had developed entirely new approaches to battlefield coordination that rendered traditional military thinking irrelevant. Ayleid battle mages did not simply provide magical support to human infantry units, but created integrated combat systems where mystical and physical capabilities combined to produce effects that neither could achieve independently. Dwemer technological contributions extended beyond improved weapons and armor to encompass communication systems that allowed unprecedented coordination across extended battle lines. Most significantly, the diverse cultural backgrounds of Cyrodiilic forces had produced tactical innovations that emerged from the synthesis of different military traditions rather than the dominance of any single approach. The collapse of Nordic resistance at Pale Pass occurred with shocking suddenness as their carefully planned formations disintegrated under pressures they had never encountered and could not effectively counter. Jarl Ysgramor's retreat became a rout as his surviving forces discovered that their opponents possessed mobility and coordination that made conventional withdrawal tactics suicidal. The pursuit that followed demonstrated the professional competence of Cyrodiilic forces while revealing the extent to which Nordic military capabilities had been overestimated by both sides in the conflict. King Harald's response to the disaster at Pale Pass marked the end of Nordic imperial ambitions in Cyrodiil, and the beginning of a broader transformation in the political geography of northern Tamriel. Rather than attempting to continue a war that had clearly become unwinnable, he opened negotiations for a comprehensive peace settlement that would recognize Cyrodiilic independence while establishing new relationships based on mutual respect rather than imperial subordination. The negotiations that followed revealed Alessia's remarkable diplomatic skills and her sophisticated understanding of international relations. Rather than demanding punitive terms that might have created lasting resentment, she proposed arrangements that allowed Nordic leadership to maintain dignity while acknowledging the new realities created by Cyrodiilic victory. The treaty that emerged became a model for international agreements that recognized sovereign equality rather than imperial hierarchy as the foundation for stable relationships between independent powers. The economic provisions of the treaty demonstrated particular innovation in their recognition that prosperity required cooperation rather than exploitation. Trade agreements established favorable terms for both parties, while creating mechanisms for resolving disputes that might otherwise have led to renewed conflict. Cultural exchange programs allowed continued contact between Nordic and Cyrodiilic populations while respecting the political independence that both sides now considered essential to their separate development. The religious clauses proved equally significant in establishing precedents for managing relationships between polities with different spiritual traditions. Rather than imposing religious conformity or creating barriers between different faith communities, the treaty recognized religious diversity as a source of strength rather than division. This approach reflected the theological sophistication that had characterized Alessia's domestic policies, while demonstrating its applicability to international relations. The formal establishment of the First Cyrodiilic Empire following the Nordic Peace Treaty marked a watershed moment in Tamrielic history that extended far beyond the immediate territorial changes involved. Alessia's success had demonstrated that imperial power could emerge from synthesis rather than conquest, from inclusion rather than domination, and from innovation rather than tradition. These principles would influence political development across the continent as other regions struggled with their own challenges of diversity and governance. The administrative structures that Alessia established to govern her new empire incorporated lessons learned from observing the failures of previous imperial systems, while developing original solutions to problems that no previous ruler had successfully addressed. The central government maintained sufficient authority to coordinate provincial activities, while allowing local communities to preserve cultural autonomy and manage their immediate affairs according to traditional practices. The integration of magical and technological capabilities that had proven decisive in military contexts extended into civilian administration through the creation of communication networks, transportation systems, and public works projects that connected distant regions while respecting local preferences and priorities. These infrastructure investments generated economic opportunities that strengthened imperial unity through shared prosperity rather than coercive compliance. The legal framework that emerged during this period established principles of justice that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries while acknowledging the legitimate diversity of customs and traditions that characterized Cyrodiil's population. Rather than imposing uniform legal codes that might have conflicted with established practices, Alessia created judicial systems that could mediate between different legal traditions while maintaining consistent standards for fundamental rights and obligations. The military organization of the new empire reflected similar synthetic approaches that combined the best elements from various traditions, while developing original innovations suited to Cyrodiil's specific needs and circumstances. Professional standards emphasized competence and loyalty rather than ethnic background, creating advancement opportunities that attracted ambitious individuals from all communities while maintaining the unity of purpose that had enabled victory over Nordic forces. The educational institutions established during this period played crucial roles in creating shared Cyrodiilic identity while preserving cultural diversity that had always characterized the region. Schools and academies taught multiple languages and cultural traditions, alongside practical skills and intellectual disciplines, ensuring that future generations would possess both the specialized knowledge needed for professional success and the broader understanding necessary for effective citizenship in a diverse society. The economic policies of the early empire emphasized development strategies that could benefit all regions and communities, rather than concentrating wealth and opportunity in particular locations or among specific groups. Trade networks connected previously isolated areas while ensuring that economic growth strengthened, rather than undermined local communities and traditional ways of life. The religious settlement that Alessia negotiated among Cyrodiil's diverse spiritual communities became one of her most lasting achievements, creating frameworks for cooperation that would survive political upheavals and dynastic changes for centuries to come. Rather than establishing state religions or suppressing minority faiths, she developed institutional arrangements that allowed different religious traditions to contribute to public life while maintaining their doctrinal independence and spiritual autonomy. These early achievements established foundations for imperial development that would influence Cyrodiilic civilization throughout its subsequent history. The principles of synthetic governance, inclusive administration, and innovative problem-solving that characterized Alessia's reign became permanent features of imperial political culture, surviving even the most dramatic dynastic transitions and territorial reorganizations that would reshape the empire in later centuries. Yet even as contemporaries celebrated these remarkable achievements, careful observers began to identify potential contradictions within the new imperial system that might eventually threaten its stability. The very inclusiveness that had enabled Alessia's success created complexities in governance that required constant attention and sophisticated management to prevent fragmentation along the cultural and regional lines that unity policies had attempted to transcend. The technological and magical integration that had provided military advantages also created dependencies on specialized knowledge and equipment that might prove vulnerable to disruption or sabotage by hostile forces. The Dwemer alliance that had been crucial to early success carried risks as well as benefits, given the mysterious nature of Dwemer civilization and their tendency to pursue goals that other races found incomprehensible or disturbing. The international relationships that had emerged from victory over Nordic forces created new responsibilities and entanglements that limited imperial flexibility while creating potential conflicts with other powers who viewed Cyrodiilic expansion with suspicion or hostility. Success had generated expectations and obligations that would constrain future policy choices while creating pressures for continued expansion that might eventually exceed imperial capabilities. Most significantly, the personal nature of Alessia's leadership created succession challenges that threatened to undermine institutional stability once her remarkable abilities were no longer available to guide imperial development. The systems she had created depended heavily upon the particular combination of political skill, military competence, and diplomatic sophistication that she possessed, raising questions about whether future rulers could maintain the delicate balances that her reign had established. The succession crisis that followed Alessia's death in the 43rd year of her reign exposed the fundamental tensions that her remarkable leadership had managed to suppress, but never fully resolve. The Empress had produced 3 children during her long rule, each embodying different aspects of the synthetic vision that had defined the First Cyrodiilic Empire, yet none possessing the complete range of capabilities that had made their mother's reign so transformative. The eldest, Prince Belhaza, had inherited his mother's diplomatic gifts and her intuitive understanding of intercultural dynamics, making him beloved among the diverse populations of the empire's eastern provinces. The middle child, Princess Amiel, demonstrated exceptional magical abilities that rivaled those of the greatest Ayleid sorcerers, while also displaying a scholarly temperament that attracted support from the academic and religious institutions that had flourished under imperial patronage. The youngest son, Prince Gorieus, possessed military talents that exceeded even his mother's considerable strategic abilities, having led successful campaigns against raiders and border threats throughout his youth. Yet his approach to warfare emphasized traditional human tactics rather than the magical technological synthesis that had defined Cyrodiilic military innovation, creating concerns among Ayleid and Dwemer allies about his commitment to the inclusive policies that had made imperial unity possible. These divisions among the potential heirs reflected broader philosophical disagreements within imperial society about the future direction of Cyrodiilic development and the relative importance of different elements within Alessia's complex legacy. The succession debate revealed the extent to which the empire's rapid expansion had outpaced the development of institutional mechanisms for managing fundamental political transitions. Unlike the Nordic kingdoms, which possessed centuries-old traditions for royal succession, or the Ayleid city-states, which had developed elaborate councils for selecting new rulers, the Cyrodiilic Empire lacked established procedures for transferring power after the death of its founding monarch. Alessia's personal authority had been so complete, and her decision-making process so individualized, that no clear framework existed for determining which of her children possessed the strongest claim to imperial authority. The crisis deepened when it became apparent that each potential heir commanded significant support from different constituencies within the empire, creating the possibility of civil war that could destroy everything Alessia had built. The eastern provinces, with their mixed populations of humans and Ayleid remnants, rallied behind Prince Belhaza's candidacy, viewing his diplomatic skills as essential for maintaining the delicate ethnic balances that preserved the regional stability. The central territories around Lake Rumar, where imperial institutions were most developed and magical research had achieved remarkable advances, supported Princess Amiel's claim, arguing that her scholarly abilities made her uniquely qualified to guide continued intellectual and spiritual development. The western regions, where military threats remained most serious and traditional human values retained strongest influence, favored Prince Gorieus, believing that his martial prowess provided the best guarantee of imperial security against external enemies and internal dissent. This geographical division of loyalties created the terrifying prospect of territorial fragmentation that could transform the unified empire into competing kingdoms, pursuing contradictory policies and potentially hostile relationships with each other. The intervention of the Dwemer alliance proved crucial in preventing immediate civil war, though their involvement introduced new complexities that would have long-term consequences for imperial development. The Dwemer leadership, observing the succession crisis from their technological citadels, recognized that imperial collapse would threaten their own research projects and trading relationships that had become integral to their mysterious agenda. Rather than supporting any particular heir, they proposed an innovative solution that reflected their characteristic approach to complex problems through mechanical and magical engineering. The Dwemer architects designed and constructed an elaborate testing facility deep beneath the White Gold Tower, where each potential heir would face challenges specifically designed to evaluate their capabilities in the various domains essential to effective imperial leadership. These trials would assess not only traditional royal skills like military command and diplomatic negotiation, but also newer abilities like magical manipulation, technological innovation, and cultural synthesis that had become crucial to Cyrodiilic imperial success. The testing process extended over several months, during which each candidate demonstrated both strengths and limitations that clarified the nature of their potential contributions to imperial governance. Prince Belhaza excelled in scenarios requiring negotiation between conflicting parties and showed remarkable ability to find compromises that satisfied competing interests without sacrificing essential principles. His understanding of cultural differences and his talent for building trust across ethnic boundaries confirmed his suitability for managing the empire's diverse populations during peaceful periods. Princess Amiel's magical abilities proved even more impressive than anticipated, as she demonstrated not only powerful individual capabilities, but also sophisticated understanding of the theoretical principles underlying magical technological integration. Her scholarly approach to problem-solving revealed innovative solutions to administrative and technical challenges that traditional methods had been unable to address. However, her relative inexperience with military affairs and her preference for contemplative rather than active leadership raised questions about her ability to handle crisis situations requiring immediate decisive action. Prince Gorius performed exceptionally in military scenarios, developing tactical innovations that built upon his mother's strategic insights while addressing weaknesses that previous campaigns had revealed. His understanding of logistics, fortification, and battlefield psychology demonstrated that he possessed not merely personal courage, but genuine strategic intelligence that could guide imperial military development during periods of external threat. Yet his apparent discomfort with magical arts and his tendency toward authoritarian decision-making suggested potential difficulties in maintaining the collaborative approaches that had made imperial synthesis possible. The Dwemer evaluation process reached an unexpected conclusion when their analysis revealed that none of the three candidates possessed the complete range of abilities necessary for successful imperial leadership under the complex conditions that characterize the current political situation. Rather than declaring one heir superior to the others, the Dwemer proposed a revolutionary administrative innovation that would divide imperial responsibilities among multiple rulers while maintaining unified authority through carefully designed institutional mechanisms. The tripartite concordat that emerged from these deliberations established three co-emperors, each responsible for specific domains of imperial administration, while sharing ultimate authority for decisions affecting the entire realm. Prince Belhaza received responsibility for external relations, internal cultural affairs, and the eastern provinces, where his diplomatic skills would prove most valuable. Princess Amiel assumed authority over magical research, technological development, and educational institutions that required scholarly oversight and innovative thinking. Prince Gorius took command of military forces, border security, and the Western territories where traditional threats remained most serious and conventional leadership approaches retained greatest relevance. The three rulers would govern through consensus on major policy decisions while maintaining autonomy within their respective spheres of responsibility, creating a system that theoretically combined the advantages of specialized expertise with unified imperial authority. The implementation of this unprecedented governmental structure required developing entirely new administrative procedures and institutional relationships that had no precedent in Tamrielic political history. The Dwemer contributed sophisticated communication systems that allowed the three co-emperors to maintain constant contact despite geographical separation, while magical enhancements ensured that important information could be transmitted instantaneously across the Empire's vast territories. The legal framework supporting the tripartite system established clear boundaries between different spheres of imperial authority, while creating mechanisms for resolving disputes that might arise between the co-emperors. Special councils composed of representatives from all major cultural and regional groups within the empire provided advice and oversight that helped prevent any single ruler from dominating the others or pursuing policies that conflicted with imperial unity. The initial years of tripartite rule demonstrated both the potential advantages and inherent complications of the new system. The specialization of imperial authority allowed each co-emperor to focus on areas where their particular talents proved most effective, resulting in remarkable achievements in military organization, diplomatic relations, and technological innovation that exceeded what any single ruler might have accomplished. The empire's borders remained secure under Prince Gorius's military leadership, while Princess Amiel's scholarly administration produced advances in magical theory and practical applications that attracted admiration from across Tamriel. Prince Belhazar's diplomatic initiatives established favorable relationships with neighboring powers, while successfully managing internal tensions that might otherwise have escalated into serious conflicts. His cultural policies promoted artistic and intellectual development that enhanced imperial prestige while strengthening the sense of shared identity that held the empire's diverse populations together. The economic prosperity that characterized this period reflected the benefits of coordinated leadership that could address multiple challenges simultaneously rather than pursuing sequential priorities that left some problems unresolved. However, the complexity of the tripartite system also created new vulnerabilities that became apparent as the co-emperors gained experience and confidence in their respective roles. Disagreements over policy priorities began to emerge as each ruler developed their own perspective on imperial needs and appropriate responses to changing circumstances. The institutional mechanisms designed to resolve such disputes proved adequate for minor disagreements, but struggled to address fundamental philosophical differences about the empire's future direction and the relative importance of different imperial goals. The first serious crisis occurred when external pressures required coordinated responses that crossed the boundaries between different spheres of imperial authority. A series of raids by maritime peoples from the Western Islands threatened both military security and diplomatic relationships, requiring decisions that involved Prince Gorius's military responsibilities, Prince Belhazar's diplomatic authority, and Princess Amiel's technological resources for developing new defensive capabilities. The coordination challenges revealed that the tripartite system, despite its theoretical elegance, created practical difficulties in responding rapidly to complex situations that required integrated approaches rather than specialized expertise. The communication systems that the Dwemer had provided proved inadequate for the intensive consultation and negotiation that effective coordination required, while the legal frameworks for resolving inter-imperial disputes consumed valuable time during periods when immediate action was essential. More troubling was the gradual emergence of competing constituencies within imperial society that began to identify more strongly with individual co-emperors than with the empire as a whole. Military personnel naturally gravitated toward Prince Gorius's leadership, while scholars and magical practitioners increasingly viewed Princess Amiel as their primary authority. Diplomatic personnel and cultural minorities found their primary loyalty shifting toward Prince Belhazar, creating informal factions that paralleled the formal division of imperial responsibilities. These developing loyalties threatened to undermine the unity that the tripartite system had been designed to preserve. As different groups within imperial society began to pursue agendas that served their preferred co-emperor rather than the empire's collective interests. Regional variations in these factional alignments created additional complications, as some provinces developed stronger connections to particular co-emperors based on geographical proximity, cultural affinity, or economic relationships that transcended the formal administrative boundaries. The religious implications of divided imperial authority created particularly complex challenges as different spiritual communities within the empire developed varying relationships with the three co-emperors. The Cyrodiilic synthesis that Alessia had established required unified spiritual leadership to maintain its theological coherence, but the tripartite system created pressures for religious adaptation that threatened to fragment the empire's spiritual unity along the same lines as its political administration. Some religious leaders attempted to maintain neutrality by treating all three co-emperors as equally legitimate expressions of divine authority, but others began to emphasize theological principles that aligned more closely with the particular approaches favored by individual rulers. These religious developments reflected broader cultural pressures that were gradually transforming imperial society from Alessia's integrated synthesis toward a more fragmented arrangement that emphasized specialization over unity. The economic consequences of tripartite rule proved similarly complex, as different regions and industries developed closer relationships with specific co-emperors whose policies most directly affected their interests. Trade networks began to reflect these political alignments rather than purely economic considerations, creating inefficiencies and dependencies that reduced overall imperial prosperity while strengthening particular constituencies that benefited from preferential treatment. The military implications became most serious as regional forces developed primary loyalties to Prince Gorius, while other security organizations maintained closer relationships with Prince Belharsa's diplomatic apparatus or Princess Amiel's technological projects. This fragmentation of military authority created coordination challenges that became apparent during joint operations, requiring cooperation between different types of forces under different command structures. The Dwemer alliance that had been instrumental in creating the tripartite system began to show signs of strain as the three co-emperors developed different approaches to technological cooperation and resource allocation. Princess Amiel's scholarly interests aligned naturally with Dwemer research priorities, creating closer relationships that sometimes excluded her co-rulers from important decisions about technological development and magical innovation. These evolving relationships raised concerns among Prince Gorius and Prince Belharsa about the potential for Dwemer influence to become disproportionate within imperial decision-making processes, while also creating anxiety within Dwemer leadership about their ability to maintain productive relationships with all three co-emperors simultaneously. The mysterious nature of Dwemer goals and methods made these concerns particularly difficult to address through normal diplomatic channels. The succession question that had precipitated the creation of the tripartite system remained unresolved as the co-emperors matured and began to establish their own families and potential heirs. The system that had been designed as a solution to the immediate crisis of imperial succession had created new complexities about future transitions that were even more difficult to manage than the original problem. Each co-emperor's children inherited different combinations of abilities and interests that did not necessarily align with the administrative divisions their parents had established, while the question of ultimate imperial authority remained ambiguous in ways that could create even more serious succession crises in the future. The institutional mechanisms that governed relationships between the current co-emperors provided no clear guidance for determining how power should be transferred to the next generation, or how competing claims from different branches of the imperial family should be resolved. The international implications of the tripartite system created additional complications as foreign powers struggled to understand how to conduct relationships with an empire that possessed three different centers of authority with overlapping but distinct spheres of responsibility. Diplomatic negotiations became more complex and time-consuming, while the potential for miscommunication and conflicting commitments increased the risk of international incidents that could escalate into serious conflicts. Some foreign rulers attempted to exploit these complications by playing the co-emperors against each other, offering different terms to different imperial authorities, while hoping to secure favorable arrangements that individual co-emperors might accept without full consultation with their colleagues. These diplomatic manipulations created internal tensions within the imperial government, while reducing the empire's effectiveness in international negotiations and strategic planning. The technological and magical integration that had been crucial to early imperial success began to suffer as Princess Ayleid's specialized authority over these domains reduced the involvement of her co-rulers in decisions about research priorities and resource allocation. The synthesis that had characterized Alessian policy gave way to more compartmentalized approaches that emphasized technical excellence over integrated problem-solving. Military innovation, diplomatic intelligence, and magical research became separate domains rather than complementary aspects of unified imperial capability, reducing the empire's ability to develop integrated solutions to complex challenges that required expertise from multiple disciplines. The specialization that had initially seemed advantageous began to create limitations that reduced overall imperial effectiveness, while increasing dependence on coordination mechanisms that proved increasingly difficult to maintain. As the tripartite system matured and its inherent contradictions became more apparent, thoughtful observers began to question whether the innovative governmental structure represented a sustainable solution to imperial governance or merely a temporary expedient that had delayed rather than resolved the fundamental challenges of managing a diverse empire across vast territories with complex internal and external relationships. The legacy of Alessia's remarkable achievements remained visible throughout imperial society, but the institutional mechanisms she had created to preserve and extend those achievements were showing signs of strain that suggested the need for further innovation or the possibility of more dramatic transformation. The empire she had founded continued to prosper and expand, but the unity of purpose that had characterized her reign was gradually giving way to more fragmented approaches that emphasized particular interests over collective goals. The story of the tripartite concordat and its consequences illustrates the perpetual challenge of imperial governance: how to maintain unity while accommodating diversity, how to preserve successful innovations while adapting to changing circumstances, and how to balance specialized expertise with integrated authority in ways that serve both immediate needs and long-term stability. These challenges would continue to shape Cyrodiilic development throughout the centuries that followed, as successive generations of leaders struggled to preserve the achievements of their predecessors while addressing the new problems that success itself had created. The ultimate resolution of these mounting tensions came not through internal reform or external intervention, but through the mysterious event that scholars now term the Great Vanishing of 1E243. In a single night, without warning or apparent cause, the entire Dwemer population of Tamriel simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only their magnificent constructions and the haunting silence of abandoned workshops still warm with the heat of interrupted labor. The tripartite empire, so dependent upon Dwemer technological integration and magical synthesis, found itself suddenly bereft of the very foundations upon which its most sophisticated innovations had been built. The immediate aftermath revealed the extent to which imperial society had become reliant upon Dwemer expertise in ways that extended far beyond simple technological assistance. Communication networks that had enabled coordination between the three co-emperors fell silent as their mystical components required maintenance that no remaining scholars understood. Defensive installations throughout the empire's borders began to fail as their hybrid magical mechanical systems succumbed to entropy without proper care. Most devastating of all, the great infrastructure projects that had physically united the empire's diverse territories started to deteriorate, severing connections that had taken decades to establish. Princess Ayleid's desperate attempts to preserve Dwemer knowledge revealed the true scope of imperial dependence upon their vanished allies. Her most talented mages and scholars worked frantically to decode the principles underlying Dwemer innovations, but found themselves confronting technologies so advanced and methodologies so alien that meaningful comprehension seemed impossible. The workshops and laboratories that had produced the Empire's most sophisticated achievements became monuments to lost knowledge. Their purpose is clear: but their methods forever beyond mortal understanding. The political consequences proved equally devastating as the careful balance between the three co-emperors collapsed without the neutral technological foundation that had made their cooperation possible. Prince Gorieus, freed from dependence upon magical enhancements he had never fully trusted, moved aggressively to consolidate traditional military authority while arguing that the empire's survival required abandoning the experimental policies that had created such dangerous vulnerabilities. His forces occupied key installations throughout the Western territories, establishing direct control over resources and populations that had previously been governed through collaborative arrangements. Prince Belhaza found his diplomatic authority undermined as the communication systems that had enabled his far-reaching negotiations ceased to function, leaving him unable to maintain the complex relationships he had cultivated with allied powers and internal constituencies. The cultural synthesis he had promoted began to fragment as different communities lost the technological connections that had made imperial integration practically beneficial rather than merely theoretically desirable. Princess Amiel's scholarly domain suffered the most dramatic collapse as the magical research that had formed the core of her authority became impossible to continue without Dwemer collaboration. Her attempts to preserve what knowledge remained led to increasingly desperate experiments that alarmed even her most loyal supporters, while her growing isolation from practical governance created opportunities for her brothers to assume responsibilities that had previously fallen within her sphere of authority. The fragmentation of imperial unity accelerated as regional populations, deprived of the technological advantages that had made imperial membership valuable, began to question whether continued loyalty to the tripartite system served their immediate interests. The eastern provinces, where Ayleid populations remained significant, experienced particular instability as ancient grievances resurfaced without the technological prosperity that had made accommodation with human rule tolerable. Within a generation, the great experiment of the First Cyrodiilic Empire had dissolved into competing kingdoms that preserved only fragments of Alessia's original vision. The technological marvels that had distinguished imperial civilization crumbled into ruins, their purposes forgotten and their construction methods lost. The cultural synthesis that had created genuine unity among diverse populations gave way to renewed ethnic tensions and territorial conflicts that would plague Cyrodiil for centuries to come. Yet even in its collapse, the First Empire had established precedents and awakened possibilities that would influence every subsequent attempt at imperial unification. The memory of what had been achieved during the Empire's golden years provided inspiration for future generations of leaders who dreamed of restoring Cyrodiilic greatness, while the lessons learned from its ultimate failure offered guidance for avoiding the dependencies and contradictions that had made such achievements unsustainable. The ruins scattered across Cyrodiil's landscape serve as constant reminders of both the heights that imperial ambition can achieve and the depths to which it can fall when the foundations of power prove less solid than they appear. In these forgotten stones and silent halls, we find the eternal story of empire itself, the perpetual cycle of rise and fall that has defined this heartland province throughout its long and tumultuous history. As we drift towards sleep tonight, let these ancient echoes remind us that even the mightiest civilizations are but temporary arrangements in the great flow of time, leaving behind only memories and ruins to mark their passage through the ages. The forgotten histories of Cyrodiil's empires whisper their lessons across the centuries, teaching us that all glory fades, all power passes, and all that remains is the endless turning of the wheel that carries new dreams toward their inevitable encounter with time's relentless passage. Sweet dreams, fellow scholars of the ancient world.